So I work for an American-based company in the healthcare space and supply chain. My road to MLOps was windy, and I think that's true for most of the people. I have an education in electronic engineering. I studied radio astronomy, and in all of those areas, my work was focused mainly on engineering. Then I moved to South Africa, where I worked for the biggest radio telescope in the world, Square Kilometer Array. This is where I met Laura, for example. So we all like veterans of that little place. Then I switched to healthcare, and I stayed in it. My current job, my title, because I work in a startup, so it's a very fancy job title. I'm a director of MLOps. What I do day to day is basically design and implement processes. And we will be talking about it during the course of the meetup. But for me, MLOps at the moment is more about people, less about technology. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that interjection. Sheldon, on to you.
Hey guys, hopefully you guys can hear me. All great. My name is Sheldon Williams. I work at Ringier, South Africa. I'm a data scientist in our team. I work for the search and data team. Yeah, I quite like the "I am the data team" comment from Thuso. Luckily, I think I have quite a lot of support across our various teams. So I don't think I can claim to be the data team, but I think my role more broadly is building machine learning services. And so I do a lot of sort of the end-to-end stuff wherever possible. So we do have a data lake, and we have data engineers and a couple of data acquisition sort of teams and roles. But sort of my job is to go find value and sort of deliver solutions in line with that. So MLOps is sort of a hugely powerful, usually important part of all that. Managing especially services at scale and in production, and putting more sort of things in production is a big part of it. So yeah. Thanks.
Yes, I guess that leaves me as the last one. I'm Demetrios. I am one of the organizers and founders of the MLOps community. And that is a place, if you are not already in there, where we gather some of the practitioners' best and brightest minds that we can find. And we just ask questions and answer questions all day, really, and talk about the different news, different platforms that are out there. My main job is trying to keep the fine line of balance between actual practitioners that are talking in the Slack channel. That is mainly the most active. Keep it between practitioners and vendors. And so I have to do a lot of yelling at vendors, because if everyone has been in a community before, you know that vendors like to try and just talk about how nice their tools are and how it solves every problem for any question ever asked. And forgive me for any vendors that are out there if you are listening. But yeah, so that's a lot of my job. Then we also do meetups like this one that we're on, and podcasts, and we get to talk to some of the big names in the field that are writing papers on different MLOps stuff. We've talked to legends like Chris Scully, or D Scully, sorry. Chris is different Scully, but D Scully, he wrote the infamous paper, which I imagine some of you have read, the high interest credit card debt of machine learning. And he also wrote the ML test score. coming out of Google. And so that's just one. Recently, we interviewed Jeremy Howard, and that was also incredible. So I get to learn from all these people, and then we share it so you all can learn too. And I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And that's about all I got.
So for me, MLOps has really two components. So there's people component and there's software component, or best practices for software that the field is still developing. For people, we know that, from experience or from all sorts of questionnaires that fly around the internet, people that came into the machine learning and data science field are not necessarily software engineers. You have researchers like myself and Laura, for example. I'm going to bring you up all the time, obviously. And my cat found the perfect time to come over. He always does that.
You always got to introduce your cat then.
Always. Yeah, let him stay there. And because in the last 5 years or whatever, we also had this, the notebooks have been massively popular among data scientists and machine learning people. And the only value in machine learning is when you can productionalize it, when you can bring it and show it to other people. And very often what happens is because of this lack of software engineering skills, that value is not necessarily materialized in many companies, and I've seen it very often. So then for your MLOps, you want to introduce people to processes and best practices to ship that software that you've been building, because we have to remember that machine learning or model is essentially software with extra input as data. So this is why it's so volatile or so difficult to manage or monitor. But because this field is so new, we're still developing those best practices. And then you have the software where you're trying to develop the pipelines and the monitoring and everything around that software to make it adhere to this quick iteration and quick deployment, or deployment without any downtime, that sort of thing. So this is how I view it. And if I had to say or give you maybe a value which is more difficult at this moment, I would say that people are more difficult in this equation. I feel that software exists, or all the tools to help us bring value from ML is already there, being the paid products that vendors offer, or all sorts of other open source solutions. But there's a paradigm shift, I think, that has to happen on the people side for us to be able to push that field forward.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Demetrios, can you give us your 2 cents about what MLOps is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seconding everything Monika said. She hit the nail on the head, and it's so much of that, like the people aspect of MLOps. And it was first brought to my attention, like MLOps or the problem. And I think what many people are starting to see is that it's not about, or it's not hard to create something that has value when you're doing it yourself. And you're like Monika was saying, you've got your Jupyter notebook and you're able to recreate something. But then when you need to go and do that at scale, that just becomes an infinitely large problem, that you start to run into all of these different pieces that you hadn't thought through. And so with the people aspect, that is, yeah, MLOps is an organizational problem, I think, not only a technical problem. And so that's really where we start to see a little bit of this crossover between DevOps and trying to do things like the agile workflows and trying to have sprints. But when you bring data into things and when you start doing like data science, it's science, right? So you're exploring and you're doing things that may hit a brick wall and you may not be able to go forward. So it's not as easy to say, all right, we're going to get done with this in 2 weeks and that's what we can finish for our sprint. So that's a little bit of a tangent as far as what MLOps is, but I would say in the short and dirty version of MLOps, it's anything that when you want to productionize and start adding value to the machine learning that you have and the machine learning models. And that's from the very beginning, from the data collection all the way till after, and these day 2 things where you're monitoring that model and making sure that it is doing what it said it was going to do.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. And Sheldon, you got any thing to add to that?
Difficult to add more value than what has already been added. I quite liked a lot of the sort of key points from Monika and Demetrios. It's an organizational problem, 100%. It's really about people. It's about how people can sort of engage with the systems in a smooth way. And I think if I had to put it in sort of a few words, not to drone on too much, but it's really about reliably productionizing machine learning. That's what it comes down to, right? And yeah, we look at a lot of sort of app development and DevOps specifically, and how it enables app development for inspiration. But it is more complicated again, because it's science, because we need more opportunity to try things. We need more opportunity to experiment. Flexibility is really important. At the same time, production often means loss of flexibility. So how can you support both? And that's sort of the challenge, I would say, of MLOps.
Cool. So we just got a nice question from the thing. Maybe Sheldon, you can answer this one. What are some of the popular MLOps software tools that are available? And I think you have a tool that you're developing, so maybe you can use that question.
You use that question to plug my own tool. That's spot on. I think Monika mentioned that I think like most of the stuff you need to productionize machine learning already exists. For us, you know, at Ringier, there's a wide array of stuff because it's a problem with a lot of parts, right? I think you need to look or focus into certain aspects of it, right? So shipping code, right? I think in the last 10, 20 years, you know, we've gone from sort of shipping code to a VM to shipping code to a container. Containers seem to be a very powerful, somewhat flexible approach to shipping code. So Docker, you'll see Docker a lot in my opinion. And then maybe more of a concept than a technology is the feature store, right? How do you stage your features? How do you prepare them? How do you give people access to them reliably? You know, it's more than just a warehouse. It's not just a warehouse. It's about sort of scheduling workflows reliably and getting your data in the right place, the right time. And I think if I have to say, you know, what technologies are in there, you know, I think a lot of really big companies from Uber to Airbnb, etc., are using things like PySpark and sort of parts of that Hadoop ecosystem, right? And things like Airflow to orchestrate, or Uzi and such things. So there's a lot of stuff, but to focus in on any one is sort of a challenging thing, right? There's a lot of companies that sort of almost do most of the parts, right? Databricks is sort of one of those platforms as a service, as you would. I think there's a few more, but I guess the general point is that there's a lot in it, and for lots of teams, the challenges and the requirements are different, and so yeah, it's in my opinion better to focus on what needs to be solved and then find a tool to solve that problem. There's a lot of tools, I would say.
That's such a good point. I just want to second that real fast and mention that a lot of people come in to this with like, oh, what tool should I learn? Or how should I use this tool with my current problem? And that's totally backwards, right? You want to go into it with, all right, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve? And then which tools will fit into that problem or will alleviate the pain that I'm having? Because maybe it's not a tool that's trying to alleviate the whole problem, but it will get those bottlenecks that you have. And so there are so many open source tools that come up every day, and there's new ones that are coming out all the time. But really it's because the other thing is like, yeah, when you're looking at the different problems that you have, you also need to remember that maybe Kubeflow is an open source tool, but Kubeflow is overkill for your problem, right? And you do not need everything that Kubeflow offers you. And so there's a paper that people quote in the MLOps community almost weekly, if not daily. And that's that paper, it's "You Are Not Google." And so like, stop trying to architect things and act like you are. And so really just the idea there is, don't like shoot yourself in the foot, or don't, try and do something because you're over engineering it. Just find what works.
So for me, it's still in its infancy, to be honest, because I think going forward, it will be more or less, we could look at it as DevOps. So in the time when we define all of those best practices, but at this very moment, I think that the field is still developing and people are still trying to define it, what it means exactly. And from this panel, you can see that we kind of agree, but we all of us have extra elements that constitute the MLOps overall. So for me, this is all starting, and maybe, we've all been seeing this rise of data engineer in the past few years. Yes, we started with data scientists, and then we merged into this machine learning scientist or engineer, and now we see this push towards data engineering, machine learning engineering. And I think this is the answer to the MLOps and to the need that the companies have to realize value from machine learning. And I think that it's a great place to be at this very moment, because we have the chance to define it, and Demetrios is at the forefront of it with collecting all sorts of ideas and knowledge from people, and with those kind of communities. This is very exciting, and I think we all have a chance to contribute meaningfully to that. And I think one of the biggest challenges would be to define agile processes for MLOps or for machine learning overall. And I know that in the community, people fight about it all the time, but there are bits and pieces that I always try to get from the discussions. But this is something that I think will be crucial for the success of MLOps going forward.
Awesome, thanks. Demetrios, you have a 2 cents to pitch in there?
Yeah, for me, it feels like it's very much day one. And like Monika was saying, we're still really trying to figure this out. And I think that's why so many people have been attracted to the MLOps community, because it's just so unclear, and we're trying to demystify the space completely. And then you top all that off with, there are so many different use cases and so many different ways of doing machine learning, and each way of doing it is very different in itself, right? Like if you have structured and unstructured data, that is a totally different thing. There are some places where they overlap, but it's not like you can have one solution or one best practice for everything. So that's why I feel like, yeah, we're still trying to figure it out right now, and it's very early days.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it sort of speaks to the heart of, like, I guess, where I am right now as a data scientist. I'm fully a data scientist, and I really want to sort of iterate more, and I want to experiment, and I want to run, experiments, etc. But to do that in a way that's both flexible and sort of impactful across my company, I have to be able to do at least some aspects of the DevOps pipeline, right? So I guess the question is, should or how can a data scientist become more involved in their ops? And I think the secret is having, firstly, people in your team with the knowledge. It really, really helps. We have a DevOps team, platform engineering team, as we call them, and their job is not just to sort of create the infrastructure and sort of do the DevOps stuff for us. It's to enable us, right? So they do workshops, they do sort of these support sessions with us, but most of all, they find tools so that we can hopefully build easier, right? So an example of this is, at least for me and my team, we are actually doing a lot of our sort of Terraform and a lot of our ops heavy kind of stuff, right? And how that works is actually PE, platform engineering. They've sort of created little bits, little components, modules for us to sort of take on board and use, right? And I think that's really, really powerful, because the data scientists should then come in more as a, I guess, consumer of those things and just use them, knowing that they have built-in security, built-in scale, right? And then I would say another thing is getting more involved in the idea of test-driven development and CI/CD and those kind of things, right? It's very scary as a data scientist, definitely, but when you understand the value it's creating for you, instead of guessing that your code will work, or instead of putting it out and hoping it doesn't break, you get to test before it goes out. And I think that's sort of something that has given me more of a comfort blanket, I would say, right? Instead of just deploying code and hoping it sticks, I try to find ways to test my code and put out code that hopefully won't come down on the weekend, which is, again, a traditional problem app developers and DevOps have dealt with for years. And maybe it's new for the machine learning app developer, if I want to call us that, right? Data scientists, people who are sort of deploying these solutions and services. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
I have to say that Sheldon is very advanced on his journey to MLOps, and I think that for many data scientists that I talk to every day, if I mention Terraform to them, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. So my suggestion would be, well, the biggest problem to go from to like start applying testing and end-to-end solution, I think that a scientist have to first take their code out of a notebook. It's a big step for a lot of people.
Yes.
And I don't know why, but there's this Python framework called Kedro, K-E-D-R-O, that hasn't really, I really don't understand why it's not more popular, because it allows a data scientists to develop with notebooks, but at the same time it introduces quietly software best practices. And I think this is such a great framework for anybody to get accustomed with pipeline building, with defining functions. So you basically can create your code in the notebook and then seamlessly transfer it to a Python code and run your experiment with a single command. And I think that if people are interested in upscaling or upskilling in trying your experiments end to end, Kedro would be one framework that I would recommend. And then another thing is that many people end their machine learning development at the model performance. So it scores that, it has this accuracy, all sorts of different metrics. But in production, rarely those matter. So basically, you train your model and you choose the best performing one. But then when it goes live, all hell breaks loose sometimes. So I would also suggest that maybe every time you train a model, expose it as a little API so people can interact with it. So you don't have to deploy it, you just share it with people, and it will help you understand the challenges. Just be open to this. I don't really feel that everybody wants to be a DevOps engineer, and I don't think they have to. But if you want to put your model in production, I would make friends with the engineering team or DevOps team or whatever IT team you have in your company, and like make friends there, and maybe you can find an ally that will help you achieve it. So you don't have to get those skills. There's somebody else who has skills in that department, and you can converge on something useful.
Awesome. And Demetrios, you got anything to follow up with?
Yeah, so there's a guy, Alexi, who also has a data science community, and he's in the MLOps community. And when I talked to him, he was mentioning, because there is this like notion of the full stack data scientist, and I feel like those are unicorns and few and far between, because just knowing enough or being able to go like really deep as a data scientist and being very advanced in data science is really hard. And then throw on top of that like the ops part and the data engineering and then all the rest that come with that. And for me, it feels like that's not realistic. But what he talked about was this T-shape knowledge and being able to have a broad understanding of most of the stuff that you're going to encounter in the development lifecycle, but then being able to go really deep on one of those pieces. And so I think Sheldon was talking about something really interesting too, and Monika too. Monika speaks like she has experience with letting the the models go live, and then all hell breaks loose, as everyone who has actually put a model into production can probably second that statement. But the hottest way to get people fired up in the MLOps community is by asking one of two questions. One is, should a data scientist learn Kubernetes? And the other is, should we productionize notebooks, or how do we productionize Jupyter notebooks? And both of those will just spark like endless debates and threads that you get like 100 replies to. And so both sides have very valid arguments and very valid points. And I think that it's up to you, but knowing like what Sheldon was saying, knowing these like basics, you don't have to go and reinvent the wheel and feel like, oh, because it is machine learning, now we have to do all of this differently. Like borrow from the wise ones that have come before us, and, test early and test often, and try to find things as soon as possible. Because as one man that I interviewed, Alfreda Deza, said, like the closer that you catch something to production, the more expensive it is, like the more costly it is, whether that is costly because of money or costly just because of resources. And then you have to go back and you have to fix it. Like the closer or the earlier that you can catch something, the better. And then just like the best practices, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people say like, yeah, we share our experiment tracking in like an Excel, or we like, there's better ways to do that now. You don't have to manually type these things in. So leverage the tools when you can. And a lot of tools are trying to build in these best practices, but then also like know what the best practices are. Don't you fully use the tools as a crutch. So I would say I love to echo one thing that one of the co-creators of Kubeflow, David Aronchik, said one time when he was on a panel for us. He was like, someone said, so MLOps is just more than the tools. And he said something like, MLOps is a lifestyle. And it's very much that. You've got to, like you said, yeah, there are these tools that do XYZ, but you don't need those tools. And that's one thing that I think a lot of the tooling companies will try and tell you that you do. need them right now, but you don't. Like, I've interviewed plenty of people that are using no fancy shiny tool, and they're still getting their models into production and able to like keep their models in production. That being said, like, keep in mind that that will be heavy cost and lots of resources on the engineering side. So if you, it all depends on, like, there's always a trade-off, right? It's very cliche to say it, but what are you trying to do? Are you trying to put something into production quickly and leapfrog? Then maybe some tools will be your best bet, because you can get them up and running and you can get everything out there really quickly in a streamlined fashion. Or do you have time to wait and get, like, hire people that know how to do this and go forward and build something? And that gets into a whole nother discussion. But yes, I would say, back to the original question, like, MLOps is a lifestyle, and that's what I'm sticking with.
I can see some stickers being made about that. Monika, you want to bring your 2 cents into it?
So for me, like, I would, again, because it's at this very moment in time, it's a lot about people. And I think that I wouldn't really personally invest in any platforms or paid services until I can make sure that the people are using them, or are used to the processes and everything that goes around it. Because otherwise, you can spend a lot of money, but in the end, it doesn't bring value to the people that produce the ML models for you. So that's one thing that I can bring.
And Sheldon, got any follow-ups?
No good ones. I think that I agree wholeheartedly with both of those things. Yeah, I would say it's a way of work. It's really not the tools. At least this is like the biggest lesson that I'm like learning from the wise developers that I work with. I'm lucky enough to work with developers with 15 years of experience, 20 years of experience, like insane amount of time actually deploying stuff. And what I notice is, firstly, good developers are always sort of aware of what's at the edge. They're like, oh, this is a cool technology, and they're having these conversations. But most of all, good developers know what they need from a tool, right? It's not about the tool doing the job. They could do it, but they'll use the tool to streamline their processes. And that's sort of key in my opinion. Understand what you need, use only what you need, find something to do it even simpler. I think that's like at the heart of like what I try to do every day.
Okay, cool.
That, but apparently the best developers are lazy, because they will
Yes.
automate everything.
I don't mind jumping into that one, especially being, I think, the last probably like 2 years at Ringier. I was the only data scientist in sort of the African or the Africa portion of Ringier, which is this huge like global company, and very difficult to get people giving you obviously data science peer reviews, but really helpful to get peer reviews from people who generally have a good eye for code, right? And so in my team especially, we pretty much had, starting out, about 4 people, 1 data scientist, I think like 2 really experienced app developers and a product manager. And the sort of base requirement was that PRs should happen and reviews should happen. So even though the app developers maybe couldn't get a deep look in on the algorithms and stuff that I was choosing, they could at least help by triaging my code, right? And this sort of encourages better code, leaner code, cleaner code, right? And so I think even with a team of 1, I guess there's also guys that are in a vastly more sort of Lone Ranger situation. But even in a team of one, it's good to find, I think Monika mentioned it, someone who sort of you can bounce ideas off and also get them to sort of triage, even if it's just your code. I think that's really important.
Awesome. Monika, what do you think about the question?
Like, I envy Sheldon because he has problems that I would like to have. So, like code reviews, yeah, I would love that. But very often people still struggle with like using Git on either any sort of platform. So I feel like I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm also on African continent, and I've seen several teams now that work with machine learning, and very often it's a lone wolf kind of approach. That people have the notebooks, people have their code, and they're very protective of it. And I think also this it's a lot about people behavior. You have to kind of coerce them into working with you, almost like. So code reviews, it's a big step, I feel, for many data scientists and machine learning scientists. And it's a bit of an advanced topic for many organizations, I feel. And again, I will like say that first take your code out of your notebook, and then we can do CI/CD or unit tests or whatever. Because I'm not sure if you noticed, but I'm against notebooks in production. So and I feel that the field can progress much faster if we can achieve this one step, getting code out of the notebook. So this is, and I wonder how a software person that finds itself in machine learning world, how you feel about this chaos around you. Aren't you completely depressed?
You execute my notebooks from the bottom up. That makes total sense. Demetrios, do you have anything to say there?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention like what Monika was saying. It isn't so easy. Like when you're messing around with Jupyter notebooks, it's really hard to do code reviews with Jupyter notebooks. So like Monika was saying, first you got to get somebody, you got to convince them that they got to live outside their notebook, and then you can start messing around with convincing them about the coding reviews. And like you were saying too, Monika, I was going to say like the Git, like making sure that they have these best practices of checking their code is another huge one. And John, before you go out and build another Git for data, let me just tell you, there's like 14 of them already. So I know what you're thinking. You're like, oh, cool. Well, there's a problem I can solve. These data scientists need to just get Git. And that has tried, like, there's so many people that are trying to do that right now. And it's just like Monika, it comes back to the whole thing, like the people and the scientific way of looking at things, I think, is a much different way of looking at it than the engineering way of looking at it. So you get that clash a little bit, and that's where you'll see the ones. I've heard from a lot of people that are much smarter than myself that it is much easier to come into MLOps from a software engineering background than it is from a data science background.
I was just going to add to that I've pretty much outlawed notebooks once things hit Git. That's a rule. And I've replaced notebooks with DVC instead. So if you don't know what DVC is, data version control, it's amazing. It will, take some getting used to, but once you understand what it's doing for you, you might not miss notebooks. It doesn't replace notebooks, but what it does, it sort of solves that urge to have a notebook, in my opinion.
Ooh, this one I ask people all the time too. It's, if I had a crystal ball and I could see ahead, I definitely think there's going to be splintering of like the ML engineering role. and you're going to see a lot of different kinds of names that you've seen it in DevOps too, like DevSecOps, right? And then you have the SRE and whatever else comes along with that, like the specialized ones. And we make jokes about it in the community of like, how are we going to call MLSecOps? Is that the next thing? Or is it going to be Dev MLSecOps? And some people say there's this new breed coming out that's going to be like the MLRE. And so you'll see all of that, and there's going to be a lot of that chaos that's happening for who knows how long. But what I keep coming back to is the fact that it is so diverse when it comes to machine learning. It's not quite like DevOps. When you throw data into things and then you're doing different things with data and you're doing it in different ways, you have so many different routes that it can take. So I don't think we're going to get like a clear consolidation on it. What you will find is, and we just saw it today with like Algorithmia being bought by Data Robot, a lot of these big tooling companies, I think, are going to start eating the smaller tooling companies. And there's something interesting that's happening in the community too, where there's a lot of these tooling companies that are trying to push for like a canonical stack that will say, all right, if you're doing deep learning, this is the stack that you should be using, just like you have in these other areas. But right now, at least in my opinion, and I've told and they're called, and so if anyone wants more information about that, it's like the AI Infrastructure Alliance that is doing that. But the diagrams that I've seen are overkill for 90% of the teams. It's like, let's get all of these different tools that do all of these different things. And then a lot of them have a lot of overlap, right? And then we'll piece them together and there's your stack. There's your canonical stack. And it's like 20 different tools. And so that's not going to be viable, especially not 5 years down the road, right? So what I imagine is going to happen is you're going to get the consolidation, and there will be tools that will get eaten up, just like today we saw, and then you'll have different stacks for different kinds of use cases. And yeah, that's what I feel like is coming, but who knows where it's going to actually go.
That's great. Monika?
So it's difficult because I know what I would like it to become, but at the same time, I know that there's stuff that machine learning is only good when there's a lot of diversity in it, and you have people from different backgrounds. So me being an engineer, I would love MLOps to be very engineering driven, very like, a lot of processes and best practices. But at the same time, I know that ML field benefits from people from backgrounds different than pure software engineering. So you have researchers and people that, switch to programming in their 30s or 40s. And I think this is something that to keep this this diversity in ML and MLOps, it's going to be a challenge, but I hope that it will be still diverse, even though that I think that MLOps will be going more and more into more of the engineering side, but hopefully we keep in mind, or we make it easier for everybody to be on the same train, basically. I don't know how to do it, but I hope that it will somehow happen this way.
Yeah.
Cool. Sheldon?
I'm sitting here trying to think of better ideas than my colleagues on the panel. I think there will be a mix, definitely. I think there'll be a mix of perhaps enterprises or big enough teams, put it that way, moving to sort of some vendor lock-in that gives them most of what they need. I guess that's kind of what we have today, but the big difference is there'll be far less vendors, and I definitely think there's this sort of situation where big vendors are eating the small ones. But I also think just because of, I guess, what we've seen historically. AWS, GCP, Azure will also produce sort of very competitive product SKUs, such that you could ask the question, do we need the big team? Can we go this way? I actually see, maybe it's a bit of an outlaw approach, but I see a situation where you don't actually need to think about those big well-known brands, because in your cloud, these services are already there, right? And I think maybe the last one is, I think there will be specialized tooling that improves the development ecosystem for sort of data science at large, right? And we see parts of it already, right? DVC I mentioned again, but if you look at their actual ecosystem, they're building a set of tools that you can see is like touching experiments, touching data registries and stuff, very tangential to things like feature stores and such. And I think eventually someone will come along, either aggregate those things or aggregate similar things and produce sort of a complete platform as a service, right? Knowing not to touch too much, knowing when to use serverless, but I think there's sort of that option as well, so that you could have that almost like one-click environment. You come, you pay your money, and you get the no hassle scalable service, right? That's sort of how I see it, like those three.
Awesome.
One thing also that, if we have time, I just wanted to chime in on is that so many more companies are going to start doing or are doing ML right now. And back to the people problem, what I foresee is that you're going to have all these different stakeholders that touch this cycle, or the development cycle, and then you have the business side of things. They're all going to start understanding what machine learning can do and what it can't do, hopefully. Because I know that up until now, it's been a lot of like, oh, we'll just throw machine learning at it and that will solve all our problems. Or you'll have the executive that will say, well, can't we use some kind of AI to like solve that problem? And we don't really understand what AI or machine learning can do yet and can't do. And so hopefully with time, that is going to better find its place, and we're going to start seeing that and understanding from the stakeholders of like, this is a really hard problem, and this is not something that we can just figure out in 6 weeks and say like, here's our epic that we're going to finish it off with.